They laughed when he buried the horse, said a man with empty pockets shouldn't waste daylight on something already gone. But by sunrise, not a single voice in that town would dare say his name out loud again. The ground was still cold when Ethan Cole drove the shovel into it, the metal biting through dry earth just beyond his fence line where the land turned harder, less forgiving, like it didn't want to remember anything buried beneath it. And maybe that was why no one else had stepped forward, not the men leaning on the saloon rail, not the ranchers riding past with narrowed eyes, not even the ones who had seen the child standing there beside the fallen horse, small hands resting on its neck as if waiting for it to breathe again. Because out here, people learned early that some things weren't theirs to touch, and anything tied to the tribes carried a weight that most folks preferred to ride around rather than face. Ethan didn't ride around it. He never had. Not when it came to things that felt unfinished. And there was something about the way the horse lay there, still and quiet but not abandoned, that told him leaving it would be worse than any trouble digging might bring. So he kept working, steady and slow, the sound of shovel against dirt cutting through the dry morning air while the child watched without a word, her dark eyes following every movement like she was measuring something deeper than the whole taking shape. The horse had been young, strong once. You could tell by the lines of its legs and the way its mane still caught the light even in stillness. And Ethan found himself brushing dust from its side before lowering it down. A small, almost careless gesture that no one in town would have understood, but the child did, because her fingers tightened around something in her palm, a small leather bracelet worn thin with time, and when she stepped closer, she didn't thank him, didn't speak at all, just pressed that bracelet into his hand like it weighed more than words ever could. He almost gave it back, almost told her it wasn't necessary, but something in the way she looked at him stopped that thought cold, so he closed his fingers around it instead. Feeling the rough edges of leather against his skin as he finished covering the horse, packing the dirt down firm, marking the place with a simple post cut from his own fence. Nothing fancy, just enough to say this mattered, even if no one else agreed. By the time the sun dipped low, the child was gone, slipped back into the trees without a sound, leaving Ethan alone with a mound of fresh earth and a bracelet he didn't understand. And as night settled over the ranch, quiet and heavy, he turned that small piece of leather over in his hands, tracing the patterns carved into it, wondering why it felt like holding on to something unfinished rather than something given. And somewhere out beyond the dark, far past where the land rolled into shadows, something had already begun to move, not fast, not loud, but steady, like a promise keeping its time. The town did not speak of it that evening, but it watched, because towns like this always watched, from behind half-closed shutters and through the slow tilt of whiskey glasses, measuring a man not by what he said, but by what he chose to carry when no one was looking. And Ethan Cole had chosen to carry something that did not belong to him, not the horse, not the silence around it, and certainly not the meaning behind that small leather bracelet now resting on the rough wood of his table. The wind moved differently after sundown, slipping through the gaps in his cabin walls with a low, steady breath that carried the scent of dry grass and distant sage. And somewhere beneath it all, something else, something older, something that made the air feel heavier without changing its shape. And Ethan noticed it the way a man notices a storm before it shows itself, not with his eyes, but with that quiet instinct that keeps him awake when everything else says he should sleep. He sat there longer than he meant to, turning the bracelet over in his fingers again and again, tracing the worn grooves etched into the leather, patterns that did not follow any ranch brand he had ever seen, not cattle, not land markers, something else entirely, something deliberate. And every time he thought to set it down, his hand hesitated like it understood. Something his mind did not. Outside, the night stretched wide across the land, empty in the way only open country can be, where distance swallows sound, and even the creak of a fence post feels like it belongs to another world. But tonight that emptiness felt different, not quiet, just waiting, like the land itself was holding its breath. A horse in the neighboring field shifted once, then stilled, ears angled toward the horizon, and Ethan followed that direction without thinking, stepping out onto the porch where the boards still held the warmth of the day, his boots settling into the familiar grooves worn by years of standing in the same place, looking out over the same stretch of land, except it did not feel like the same land anymore. He could not see anything at first, just darkness rolling over low hills and the faint outline of his fence cutting across it like a boundary no one had tested in a long time. But the feeling did not leave. It stayed, settled in his chest, steady and certain, not fear, not yet, just the understanding that something had already been set in motion the moment he chose not to walk away. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly as the wind shifted again, and the bracelet in his hand felt warmer than it should have, as if it had been held by someone else just seconds before. And for the first time since he picked it up, Ethan wondered if that child had not been leaving him a gift at all, but a message, something passed without words, something that did not ask for thanks, only recognition. He closed his fingers around it once more, tighter this time, then slipped it into his pocket like a man putting away something he knew he would need before morning. And when he finally stepped back inside, the night did not follow him. It stayed out there, stretched across the land, patient, quiet, and moving closer with every passing hour. Morning did not arrive the way it usually did, slow and forgiving, with light stretching gently across the land like it had all the time in the world. Instead it came sharp and deliberate, a thin line of pale gold cutting across the horizon as if something had drawn it there with purpose, and Ethan was already awake before it reached his window, not because of sound, but because of the absence of it, the kind of silence that does not belong to empty land but to something waiting just beyond sight. He stepped outside with the same steady pace he carried into everything, boots settling into the dust, breath steady, eyes scanning the familiar stretch of fence and open field. But nothing felt familiar now, not the way the air pressed against his chest, not the way the horses in the far pasture stood still as stone, their heads lifted in the same direction like they were listening to something too distant for human ears. Then he felt it, not heard it, not yet, but felt it, a faint tremor beneath the ground, subtle enough that a man could mistake it for imagination if he had not spent his life standing on this same patch of earth, learning every shift and whisper it carried. And this was not imagination. This was movement, steady and measured, growing stronger with each passing second. He turned toward the horizon just as the first shapes broke through the morning haze, small at first, barely more than shadows against the rising light. But they did not scatter like riders usually did not spread out or drift. They moved as one, a single line that widened, deepened, multiplied, until 1 became 10, 10 became 50, and 50 became more than a man could count without stopping to breathe. Dust did not rise the way it should have beneath so many horses. It stayed low, hugging the ground like it did not dare climb higher, and the riders themselves made no sound that carried this far, no calls, no commands, just the steady rhythm of something controlled, something intentional. Ethan did not reach for a weapon, did not step back. He simply stood where he was, one hand resting near his pocket where the bracelet lay hidden, the leather pressing faintly against his palm as if reminding him of the choice he had already made. The line of riders stretched wider now, curving slowly as they approached, not toward him directly, but around, forming a shape that only became clear when it was nearly complete, a wide arc bending across the land until it touched the far edge of his fence. And kept going, closing in, not rushing, not threatening, just surrounding with a patience that carried more weight than any shouted warning ever could. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, casting full light across the ranch, there were no gaps left, only figures on horseback spaced with perfect distance, each one still, each one facing inward, and Ethan realized with a calm that surprised even him that this was not an arrival meant to be seen. It was an arrival meant to be understood, and whatever answer they had come for, it was already standing right there in the dust, waiting. No one moved, not at first, not even the wind. And that was the part that settled deepest into a man's bones, because out here silence usually meant distance, meant space, meant nothing close enough to matter. But this silence had weight. It pressed in from every direction, carried by 300 riders who sat their horses without shifting, without a single wasted motion, as if time itself had slowed to match their stillness. Ethan stood just inside the line of his fence, boots planted in the same dust he had walked 1,000 times before, yet it felt like standing on ground he had never known, and he let his eyes move slowly across them, not searching for threat, not counting numbers, just taking in the shape of what had come, the way each rider held their place with quiet precision, The way no weapon was raised, no voice called out, and somehow that made it heavier than if they had come shouting. The sun climbed higher, light spilling over leather and worn cloth, catching on feathers and beads that did not flash or draw attention, but carried their own kind of presence, subtle, deliberate, like every piece meant something even if you did not understand it. And for a long moment nothing changed, no signal, no movement, just that steady circle holding him at its center. Then, from the far side of the arc, one rider stepped forward, not fast, not slow, just enough to break the pattern, and the shift rippled outward in a way that could not be seen, but could be felt, like a breath taken by something larger than any one man. He rode a few yards closer, stopping well beyond the fence, keeping that same distance the others held. And even from here Ethan could see the difference in the way he carried himself, not louder, not larger, but certain, the kind of certainty that did not need to prove itself. Their eyes met across the space between them, and for the first time since dawn, Ethan felt the moment narrow, everything else falling quiet behind it, until there was only that gaze and the faint weight of the bracelet pressing against his palm. He did not reach for it yet, did not speak, did not move beyond a small shift of his shoulders, because something told him that whatever this was, it was not meant to be rushed, and out here, rushing the wrong moment could turn a man into something he never intended to be. The riders studied him in return, not with anger, not with judgment that showed itself openly, but with a depth that measured more than actions, something that seemed to look past the surface of things into the reasons beneath them. And that look lingered, stretched just long enough to make time feel uncertain again. Behind the rider, the others remained still, no horse stepping out of line, no hand lifting, and the fence between them stood unchanged, a simple boundary of wood that suddenly felt like the only thing holding two worlds apart. Ethan finally let his hand move, slow and deliberate, drawing the bracelet from his pocket, the leather catching the morning light in a way it had not the night before, and as he held it there, not offering it forward, not hiding it away, just letting it be seen, something shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like a door opening without a sound. The rider's posture changed by a fraction, not enough for most men to notice, but enough for Ethan, and in that small movement lay the first answer to a question that had been forming since the moment he chose to dig that grave, an answer that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with what a man chooses to honor when no one is watching. The shift did not come with a sound, but it carried through the line of riders like a ripple across still water, subtle and precise, each man adjusting not his position but his presence, as if something unseen had just been acknowledged and accepted without the need for words. The rider at the front lowered his gaze for the briefest moment, not in submission, not in weakness, but in recognition, and when his eyes lifted again, they no longer measured Ethan as a stranger standing behind a wooden fence. They saw him as something else entirely, something that had crossed a line no map could draw. Ethan did not move from where he stood, the bracelet resting in his open palm, the worn leather catching the light in a way that made its markings clearer now, lines and shapes that seemed almost alive under the morning sun, and for a moment he wondered if it had always looked like this, or if he had simply never known how to see it before. The rider turned slightly in his saddle, enough for those behind him to catch the motion, and that was all it took. No command, no raised voice, just that single movement passed through 300 men until the entire circle responded as one, not tightening, not advancing, but changing, their stillness becoming something deeper, something deliberate. Then, slowly, the rider brought his right hand to his chest, fingers resting there in a gesture that carried weight far beyond its simplicity, and held it for a count that felt longer than time itself, before lowering it again. What followed was not immediate, but it was certain, one by one, in perfect sequence. Each rider mirrored the same motion, a wave of quiet acknowledgement that moved around the ranch until it reached the last man and settled into silence once more. Ethan felt it in his chest before he understood it in his mind, the shift from tension to something steadier, something grounded, and he realized that whatever judgment he had expected, whatever reckoning he thought might come from this gathering, it was not what stood before him now. The wind picked up just enough to stir the grass along the fence line, carrying with it the faint scent of earth freshly turned, the place where the horse lay beneath the soil, and without thinking, Ethan turned his head toward that spot, his eyes resting on the simple post he had set there, a marker that had seemed small in the moment but now felt like the center of everything. When he looked back, the rider was watching him again, but the hardness had softened into something else, something quieter, and for the first time since they arrived, the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a space filled with understanding. The rider reached into a small pouch at his side and drew out something wrapped in cloth, holding it carefully for a moment before leaning forward just enough to place it on the ground beyond the fence, not crossing the boundary, not forcing the space, simply leaving it there as if it belonged exactly where it rested. Then he straightened, gave the smallest nod, and without another movement, turned his horse back toward the line, the circle holding its shape, the silence returning, but no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. Now it carried something else, something that did not need to be spoken because it had already been seen. For a long moment after the rider turned away, nothing else followed, no command, no signal to break the circle, just that same steady quiet settling back over the land like it had never been disturbed. And yet everything had changed in a way Ethan could feel more than explain, like the air itself had shifted its weight and chosen a different direction to lean. He did not move right away, did not step forward or call out, because whatever had just been given was not something meant to be rushed, and out here, a man learned that the wrong step taken too soon could undo something that took a lifetime to earn. The object rested just beyond the fence, wrapped in cloth that stirred slightly in the breeze, and even from where he stood, Ethan could sense that it carried the same quiet gravity as the bracelet in his hand, something small in size, but heavy in meaning, something placed, not dropped, and that difference mattered. He glanced once more at the line of riders, expecting perhaps a sign, a final motion, but they remained as they were, still and watchful, not guarding, not threatening, simply present, as if waiting not for him to act, but for him to understand. So he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, boots pressing into the dust, with a sound that felt louder than it should have in the silence. Each step measured until he reached the fence line, the wooden post rough beneath his hand as he paused there for a heartbeat, acknowledging the boundary before crossing it in the only way it could be crossed, not with force, but with respect. He leaned forward just enough to reach the cloth, his fingers closing around it carefully, and as he lifted it, the breeze caught the edge, revealing a glimpse of what lay beneath, a polished stone bound in leather, marked with the same patterns as the bracelet, only deeper, older, as if time itself had carved them there. The moment his hand fully took hold of it, something settled inside him, not a sudden realization, not a clear answer, but a certainty, quiet and steady, that this was not a payment, not a debt being cleared, but a recognition of something he had done without knowing its weight at the time. He straightened slowly, holding the object in both hands now, and when he looked up again, the rider at the front had shifted back into place among the others, no longer separate, no longer standing apart, just one of many once more, the circle complete again, whole and unmoving. Then, as if the moment had reached its natural end, the change came, not all at once, but in a slow, unified motion, one rider turning, then another, until the entire line began to move, not away in haste, not scattering, but peeling back from the ranch in the same controlled silence with which they had arrived, their horses stepping lightly across the earth, leaving no mark that would last beyond the day. Ethan watched them go without following, without calling out, the object still steady in his hands, the bracelet now tucked safely against his chest, and as the last of the riders disappeared beyond the rise, the land returned to its familiar shape, open and quiet, yet no longer empty, because something had been left behind that could not be seen from a distance, something that would remain long after the dust settled, long after the story passed from one voice to another, something that did not need to be explained because it had already taken root where it mattered most. By mid-morning, the land looked the same as it always had, the fence stretching in its quiet line, the grass bending under a steady breeze, the sky wide and indifferent above it all. But anyone who knew how to look would have seen the difference, not in what remained, but in what no longer pressed against it, that weight from earlier gone, replaced by something steadier, something that settled deep into the ground like a mark that did not need to be carved. Ethan stood for a long time where the riders had left him, the object still in his hands, turning it once in the light, as if expecting it to change again, but it did not. It remained what it was, a stone wrapped in leather, worn smooth in places where other hands had held it before his. And yet it carried more presence than anything he owned, more than the land, more than the cattle, because none of those things had ever been given in this way. He finally stepped back inside, placing it carefully on the same table where the bracelet had rested the night before, the two objects now lying side by side like pieces of a story he had only just begun to understand. And for a moment he simply looked at them, not trying to name their meaning, just accepting that some things did not ask to be explained. Outside, the world began to move again, slow at first, then with growing confidence. A rider passing far down the road where he had not dared ride earlier, a distant door opening in town, the faint echo of voices returning as if someone had given permission for sound to exist again. By noon, the first man came up the road toward Ethan's ranch, not riding fast, not calling out, just approaching with the cautious curiosity of someone who had seen something he could not quite believe and needed to confirm it with his own eyes. He stopped well short of the fence, looking across the land, then at Ethan, then at the ground where the riders had stood, and whatever question he carried seemed to fade before it ever reached his mouth. Ethan did not offer an explanation, did not step forward to fill the silence. He simply stood there the same way he had that morning, steady, unchanged, and that seemed to be answer. Enough. The man tipped his hat slightly, not in greeting, not quite in respect, but in something close to it, then turned his horse and rode away without another word. It did not stop there. Others came, some closer, some keeping their distance, all carrying that same quiet uncertainty, and each one left the same way, without questions, without challenge, as if they had all come expecting one kind of story and found another waiting in its place. By late afternoon, the town had begun to shift, not loudly, not in ways that could be pointed to or named, but in the way men looked toward the ranch now, in the way they chose their paths when riding near it, in the way the fence no longer felt like just wood and wire, but something that held a line no one felt the need to cross without reason. Ethan noticed it without acknowledging it, the same way he had noticed everything else, quietly, without claiming it, because whatever had changed out here was not something he had taken, it was something that had been left behind, and it carried its own understanding without asking him to explain it to anyone else. That evening, the light settled slower than usual, stretching long across the land as if it, too, was reluctant to leave, and Ethan found himself standing by the fence again, not because he expected anything more to come, but because something about that place had changed in a way that drew him back without asking. The post he had driven into the earth stood where it always had, simple and unmarked. Yet now it carried a presence that could not be mistaken, and beside it, the ground where the horse lay seemed quieter than the rest of the field, as if the wind chose to move around it instead of through it. He stepped closer, boots pressing softly into the dirt, and for a moment he just stood there, looking down, not searching for signs, not expecting anything to reveal itself, only acknowledging what had been done and what had been returned. The bracelet rested in his pocket, the stone now secured back on the table inside, and yet he could feel both of them as clearly as if he held them again, their weight no longer unfamiliar, no longer uncertain, but settled, like they had found their place. From the edge of the trees, where the land dipped into shadow before rising again into open range, a small figure appeared, still and quiet, almost easy to miss if a man did not already know where to look, and Ethan did not turn right away, did not call out, because something told him this moment belonged to stillness more than sound. The child stepped forward slowly, the same measured pace she had carried before, her eyes moving not to him, but to the place where the horse rested beneath the soil, and when she reached the fence, she stopped, her hand lifting just enough to touch the top rail, fingers resting there lightly, as if greeting something unseen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the distance between them unchanged, yet no longer uncertain. And then she looked up, meeting his eyes with that same depth he had seen before. Only now there was no question in it, no searching, only quiet understanding. She nodded once, small and certain, then reached into the fold of her clothing and drew out a single feather, worn but carefully kept, and placed it gently against the fence post before stepping back again. Ethan watched her without moving, without breaking the stillness, because he understood now that what passed between them did not need words, did not need explanation. It carried itself in the space between actions, in the choices made without witness. The child turned then, just as quietly as she had come, and disappeared back toward the trees, her steps leaving no mark that would last beyond the moment, and yet something of her remained, just as the riders had left something behind that morning. The wind picked up again, soft and steady, brushing across the land, catching the feather where it rested and lifting it just enough to move without taking it away, and Ethan reached out after a moment, steadying it against the post, not claiming it, not removing it, simply making sure it stayed where it had been placed. As the last light faded, the ranch returned to its usual quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of emptiness. It was the quiet of something understood, something held, and for the first time since he had arrived on this land, Ethan realized that belonging did not always come from owning a place. Sometimes it came from honoring it in a way no one else thought to try. Days passed, then weeks, and the land settled into a rhythm that felt unchanged to anyone passing through. But to those who paid attention, there was a difference that could not be named, only noticed in the way things no longer happened the way they used to. Riders still crossed the distant hills, dust still rose along the old trails, and the town still carried on with its quiet routines. But when paths came near Ethan Cole's fence, they bent just slightly, just enough to avoid crossing without reason, as if the ground itself suggested another direction and men chose to listen without asking why. Ethan did not speak of what had happened, not because he meant to keep it hidden, but because there was nothing in it that could be explained in the kind of words men traded over coffee or whiskey, and he had learned that some truths lost their shape the moment they were forced into language. The bracelet remained with him, worn now at his wrist where the leather had begun to soften with time, and the stone rested on the shelf inside his cabin, catching the light each morning in a way that felt less like reflection and more like remembrance. The feather stayed where it had been placed, secured against the post by nothing more than care, and though the wind came and went, though storms passed through and seasons shifted, it never fell, never drifted away, as if it, too, understood that it had found the place it was meant to remain. Once, a group of men rode close, closer than most had dared since that morning, their voices louder than necessary, their curiosity sharper than their caution, but even they slowed as they approached, their words fading into something quieter, until one of them finally turned his horse aside without explanation, and the others followed without question, leaving the space around the fence untouched, as if they had felt something they could not argue with. Ethan watched them go the same way he watched everything now, without judgment, without claim, simply aware, and when he turned back toward the land, there was no sense of ownership.